It all started on a quiet evening in our living room, the kind of evening I had come to cherish after 23 years of marriage. Amy sat across from me on the couch, her face tense. I asked her if something was wrong, expecting maybe work stress or a minor issue. But then she said the words that gutted me. I've been seeing someone else. For 2 years. For a moment, I couldn't process it. It felt like I was outside my own body, watching this happen to someone else. When she mentioned his name, Matt, her younger coworker, it was like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything at first, so she went on, explaining how she wasn't happy in our marriage anymore and how Matt made her feel alive. She told me she wanted to leave and start fresh with him. The tears came before the words. I begged her to reconsider, to think about the family we built together. I asked her if our years together meant anything to her. She looked at me coldly, almost bored, and said, "I've made up my mind. I'll pack some things tonight." That was when something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to sit there and let her trample all over me and the life we'd created. I told her to leave immediately. If she thought she'd be happier with Matt, fine, but she wasn't going to disrespect me under my own roof. Her response? She scoffed and accused me of being controlling. As if asking for loyalty in marriage was a crime. She walked out the door with a suitcase in hand, saying she'd be back for the rest of her things. That night, I sat in the living room staring at the empty spot where she had been. My heart felt like it had been ripped apart. The house was quiet without her, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that reminded you something was missing, even though deep down, I knew that what I was missing was already gone long before she confessed. After she left, I tried to imagine what her new life with Matt would look like. I pictured her filled with excitement, believing she was stepping into a perfect, carefree relationship. For 23 years, I had been the one carrying the weight of responsibility, balancing bills, fixing problems, raising our kids, and now she thought she could escape all that with a younger man who whispered sweet nothings in her ear. It hurt to think she thought so little of everything we'd built together. But the cracks in her fantasy appeared faster than I expected. A week after she left, mutual acquaintances started reaching out to me, sharing snippets of what they had seen or heard. I wasn't asking for information, but it found its way to me regardless. It turned out that Matt wasn't quite the Prince Charming Amy had imagined. For one, he wasn't interested in any kind of commitment. He was single, yes, but far from available. Apparently, Amy wasn't the first coworker he had been involved with, just the latest in a string of flings. Some of the women overlapped, and none of them lasted. Word spread around her workplace, too. People whispered about the affair, and Amy became a topic of gossip. Matt's reputation as a serial dater wasn't a secret, so Amy's colleagues weren't shocked when he brushed her off after she left me. What surprised everyone, including her, was how fast he distanced himself. When she asked him about a future together, he apparently laughed it off, telling her he wasn't looking for anything serious. The realization must have hit her like a ton of bricks. She had burned her bridges with me and the kids, walked out of our home, and torched her reputation, all for a man who had no intention of standing by her. I imagined her in the cheap apartment she had hastily rented, staring at her phone, waiting for Matt to call. But of course, he didn't. From what I heard, he stopped replying to her texts altogether. For someone like Amy, who always had a way of twisting situations to suit her narrative, this had to be humiliating. She wasn't just facing rejection from Matt. She was starting to realize that the grass wasn't greener. Her perfect escape plan had failed. I wasn't there to witness her unraveling, but I didn't need to be. People love to gossip, and Amy's downfall made the rounds in our small community. Someone told me she had shown up at work looking disheveled, only to leave early after overhearing coworkers talk about her behind her back. Another time, a friend mentioned seeing her at the grocery store, looking lost and embarrassed as if she wanted to avoid being recognized. While I didn't take any joy in hearing about her struggles, I won't pretend it didn't feel like justice. She had shattered our family, but the reality of her decisions was finally catching up with her. I wasn't going to reach out, though. I was done trying to make sense of her actions or clean up the mess she created. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. What did surprise me was how quickly Matt's other flings came to light. He had been involved with at least 2 other women at their office, both of whom found out about each other and Amy at almost the same time. It caused a scandal that had people in the office whispering about him as much as her. From what I heard, he left his job shortly after, moving on to another city to escape the backlash. Amy was left behind in the wreckage, alone and with no one to blame but herself. At least, that's how I saw it. In the days following Amy's departure, I braced myself for the fallout within our family. What I didn't expect was how quickly the lines were drawn. Our 2 children, both in their early 20s, were devastated when they found out what had happened. I debated softening the truth, thinking I could shield them from some of the ugliness, but there was no point in sugarcoating it. They deserved to know what had torn their family apart. When I told them, their reactions hit me harder than anything Amy had done. They were heartbroken, confused, and, most of all, furious. They couldn't understand how their mother, who had always seemed so devoted to us, could throw everything away for someone like Matt. They said they'd noticed her becoming distant in the last couple of years but had chalked it up to the stress of work or simply growing older. Now it all made sense to them, and their anger was palpable. My daughter, the younger of the two, blocked Amy on every social media platform almost immediately after I told her. My son took a more measured approach at first, sending Amy a message to say he needed space to process everything. A day later, he blocked her as well. Watching them cut ties with their mother was painful, but I couldn't blame them. She had betrayed not just me, but them too. Amy tried reaching out to them, of course. She sent text after text, pleading with them to talk to her. She framed herself as the victim, claiming she had felt unloved and unappreciated at home. That was her narrative, that her affair wasn't a selfish betrayal, but a desperate act of self-fulfillment. It made me sick to think she could twist things so easily. My brother, who I've always been close with, became my rock during this time. He didn't hesitate to show up at my house as soon as he heard what had happened. He spent hours just sitting with me, listening as I poured out all the anger and pain that had been building up inside me. He didn't say much at first, which was exactly what I needed. Sometimes, it's not about getting advice, it's about having someone who will just be there with you in the middle of the storm. He was the one who encouraged me to focus on what mattered: my kids and my own recovery. I couldn't control Amy's actions, and I certainly couldn't control how she tried to spin the situation to justify herself. What I could control was how I responded. I decided to file for divorce sooner rather than later. There was no point in dragging it out or clinging to the hope that Amy might change her mind. Even if she did, I knew there was no going back for me. The trust was gone, shattered into pieces I didn't have the energy or desire to pick up. The kids supported my decision wholeheartedly. My daughter even offered to help me find a lawyer, though I assured her I could handle it. I didn't want them to feel like they had to take on my burdens. They were dealing with enough already, grieving the loss of the family they thought they had. Despite their anger, I could tell they were hurting deeply. My son stopped by the house often, not just to check on me, but to try to fill the void left by his mother's absence. My daughter, on the other hand, buried herself in work and avoided being at home for too long. It was her way of coping, and I didn't push her. We all needed to process things in our own way. Amy's absence became a gaping hole in the household, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't the loss of her presence that hurt, it was the ghost of who she used to be. Memories of her as a loving wife and mother clashed with the image of the person she had become. It was as if the Amy I married had vanished, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Meanwhile, Amy's attempts to reach out to me were relentless. She sent me long emails filled with excuses, trying to explain her affair and convince me that we could work things out. But the more she wrote, the more evident it became that she didn't truly understand the damage she had done. Her words were hollow, filled with justifications and self-pity. She wanted sympathy, not accountability. One particular email stuck with me. In it, she said she had hoped the kids would be more understanding, that they would see her as a flawed human being rather than a villain. She couldn't grasp that to them. She had abandoned her role as their mother when she chose her own desires over the well-being of our family. The community around us wasn't blind to what had happened, either. In our relatively small town, news traveled fast. People I barely knew started offering condolences or awkwardly changing the subject when I was around, unsure of what to say. Amy's reputation, once spotless, was quickly tarnished. The kids told me they'd heard from mutual friends that some of Amy's closest companions had distanced themselves from her. One of her friends even called me to apologize for not realizing what was going on. She said she felt betrayed too, as Amy had lied to everyone about her affair. It was strange to watch Amy's world unravel from a distance. For years, she had been so concerned with maintaining appearances, crafting an image of a perfect life. Now, that image was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. Through it all, I kept reminding myself of what my brother had said: focus on what matters. For me, that meant being there for my kids and taking steps toward rebuilding my life. The divorce would be a long process, and there would be more challenges ahead, but I wasn't going to let Amy's betrayal define me or my future. If there's one thing about small towns, it's that nothing stays private for long. What started as quiet whispers about Amy's affair quickly snowballed into full-blown gossip. I wasn't actively sharing details about what had happened. I didn't have to. The story seemed to spread on its own, gaining traction with every retelling. People knew she'd left me for someone younger, and they knew it hadn't worked out. That alone was enough to keep tongues wagging. Amy wasn't handling it well, from what I heard. She had always prided herself on being well-liked and respected, whether it was at work or in social circles. But now, the same people who used to invite her to their dinner parties were suddenly too busy to respond to her texts. Colleagues who used to chat with her during coffee breaks now avoided her altogether. The blowback at her workplace was swift. The details of her relationship with Matt had leaked, and the office was buzzing with speculation about how many people he had been involved with. She became the center of the drama, not as a victim, but as a cautionary tale. It didn't help that Matt had quit soon after everything came to light, leaving her to face the fallout alone. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Amy had tried to salvage her position at work by downplaying the affair. She claimed it was a mistake and that it had been blown out of proportion. But people weren't buying it. The problem wasn't just that she had been involved with Matt, it was the sheer recklessness of it all. She'd risked everything for someone who clearly wasn't worth it, and now she was paying the price. Social media became another battleground. At first, Amy posted vague messages about learning from mistakes and the power of forgiveness, clearly fishing for sympathy. She even shared a photo of herself with some generic motivational caption about resilience, as if she were the one who had been wronged. But the comments section wasn't what she'd hoped for. Some people were supportive, offering her kind words and encouragement. But others weren't as forgiving. Anonymous accounts began leaving harsh comments, calling her out for what she'd done to our family. A few even mentioned Matt by name, mocking her for being just another notch on his belt. The posts quickly turned into a battlefield, and Amy eventually disabled the comments altogether. One day, my daughter showed me a post Amy had made. It was a long, emotional message where she tried to explain her actions. She claimed she had been unfulfilled and felt trapped in a life that no longer made her happy. She wrote about how she had lost herself over the years and needed to rediscover who she was. It was all very poetic, but there wasn't a single mention of the damage she had caused, to me, to our kids, or to our marriage. Reading her words made me feel a mix of anger and pity. She was so focused on justifying her choices that she couldn't see the destruction she had left in her wake. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about her refusal to take responsibility for her actions. She wanted to be seen as a victim of circumstance, not the architect of her own downfall. Then came the breaking point. Amy must have been desperate for validation because she posted a public message asking for forgiveness from those she had hurt. It wasn't directed at me or the kids specifically. More like a blanket apology to the world. She framed it as a journey of growth, and talked about how she hoped people could find it in their hearts to forgive. But instead of sympathy, she got backlash. Someone in the comments called her out for pretending to be remorseful while continuing to shift the blame. Another commenter reminded her that she hadn't just hurt her family, she had dragged her reputation through the mud all on her own. The post was deleted within hours, but the damage was done. By this point, Amy's isolation was almost complete. Her so-called friends stopped returning her calls. The few who remained in her corner probably only did so out of pity. Even her family was struggling to stand by her. My ex-mother-in-law called me one evening to apologize, not for Amy, but for how everything had unfolded. She admitted she didn't agree with her daughter's choices and hoped I was holding up okay. It was a strange conversation, but it confirmed what I already suspected. Even Amy's family was beginning to see her in a different light. I won't lie, there was a part of me that felt vindicated watching her fall from grace. It wasn't about revenge or wanting her to suffer. It was just satisfying to see the truth come out, to watch as the image she had spent years crafting unraveled before everyone's eyes. For so long, she had been the one controlling the narrative. Now, the story was out of her hands, and people were finally seeing her for who she really was. While all of this was happening, I stayed focused on what mattered, finalizing the divorce and being there for my kids. Amy's unraveling wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control how I moved forward. And that, more than anything, gave me a sense of peace. The divorce process started with a cold sense of inevitability. I had no illusions about it being amicable. Amy and I had gone too far past that point. She wanted to maintain some level of control, maybe even save face, while I wanted to make it clear that there was no coming back from what she had done. What followed was a slow, grueling battle that tested my patience and my resolve. When I filed the paperwork, Amy acted surprised, even offended, as if she hadn't expected me to follow through. She sent a string of emails and messages, all of them dripping with manipulation. She claimed that I was overreacting, that her affair was a mistake we could grow from together. She threw in lines about our history, the family we'd built, and how she still loved me in some way. But none of it touched me. Her words felt hollow, like they were meant to serve her more than they were meant to heal anything. Her tone changed quickly when it became clear I wasn't wavering. The apologies turned into accusations. She started painting herself as the victim, claiming I was punishing her unnecessarily. She said I was trying to turn the kids against her, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I didn't need to influence them. They had seen enough for themselves to make their own decisions. The legal proceedings were a nightmare. Amy's initial response to the divorce filing was to demand a larger share of the assets, despite having been the one to leave the marriage. She argued that she had sacrificed years of her life for the family, that she deserved to be compensated for all she'd given up. I couldn't believe the audacity of it. She had thrown our life away for a 2-year affair, and now she expected me to pay for her freedom. Her demands extended beyond money. She wanted the house, the car, and even a portion of my retirement savings. It felt like she was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to anything she could after losing so much. My lawyer, a calm but sharp man named Dan, assured me we would fight her claims. He reminded me that the courts would look at the facts, not her fabricated version of events. Still, her behavior made everything harder. She tried to drag out the process, refusing to agree on even the simplest matters. Every time I thought we were close to resolving something, she would find a way to complicate it. I couldn't tell if she was being spiteful or if she genuinely believed she was entitled to more than she deserved. Either way, it was exhausting. One of the most painful parts was how she tried to weaponize our history together. She brought up old arguments, moments where I hadn't been my best self, as if those things justified what she had done. She even claimed that my focus on providing for the family had made her feel neglected, framing herself as the victim of a distant husband. It was a calculated move, one meant to paint me as the bad guy in all of this. The kids were dragged into the mess, though I tried my best to shield them from the worst of it. Amy made a half-hearted attempt to involve them in the negotiations, suggesting they might want to spend more time with her if she got the house. But my daughter shut that down immediately, making it clear she had no interest in living with her mother. My son, though quieter about his feelings, stood firmly by my side. Their loyalty meant the world to me, even if I hated that they had to take sides at all. The turning point in the divorce came when Amy's lies started to unravel in front of the mediator. She had been spinning this narrative of a loveless marriage and a husband who didn't care, but the facts didn't support her story. The mediator saw through her attempts to play the victim, especially when my lawyer presented evidence of her affair with Matt. The truth was undeniable, and it worked in my favor. Amy's reaction to losing ground was as predictable as it was pathetic. She started lashing out, blaming everyone but herself for how things had turned out. She blamed me, the kids, Matt, even her own friends for not being supportive enough. It was as if she couldn't face the reality of her choices and the consequences they had brought. Watching her spiral only solidified my decision to leave the marriage behind for good. In the end, the settlement was fair but not overly generous to her. She got a smaller portion of the assets than she had demanded, and the house remained mine. The kids stayed with me, though they were old enough to make their own decisions about visiting her. She tried to argue for more time with them, but it was clear they had no interest in being part of her new life. That, more than anything, seemed to break her. When the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, of course, relief that the ordeal was over and that I could finally start moving forward. But there was also a lingering sadness, not for Amy, but for the life I thought we had. It was hard to accept that the person I had loved and trusted for so many years had become a stranger to me. Still, I knew this was the only path forward. Amy's betrayal had taken so much from me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I had my kids, my health, and a future that no longer included her lies and manipulations. That was enough to give me hope. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The fight was over, and I had won, not just the divorce, but the chance to rebuild my life on my terms. After the divorce was finalized, life didn't immediately snap back to normal. If anything, the silence that followed was louder than the chaos. With the legal battles behind me and Amy officially out of my life, I found myself alone with my thoughts more than ever. It wasn't a bad thing, though. It gave me space to finally reflect on everything. On her, on us, and on myself. The first realization that hit me was how blind I'd been to the cracks in our marriage. Looking back, the signs were there, even years before her affair with Matt. I had ignored the subtle shifts in her behavior, The way she stopped making small gestures of affection, how she seemed less engaged in our conversations, and the increasing time she spent away from home under the guise of work. At the time, I brushed it off as the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if her dissatisfaction had been brewing for far longer than I wanted to admit. That train of thought was painful, but it also brought clarity. I started to see that our relationship had flaws I had been too stubborn to acknowledge. I wasn't perfect, of course. No one is. Maybe I did focus too much on providing and not enough on connecting. Maybe I missed opportunities to make her feel seen and valued. But even if I wasn't the perfect husband, I had always been loyal, always present, and always committed to building a life with her. Her betrayal wasn't about my shortcomings. It was about her selfishness. It wasn't just the affair itself that broke me. It was the realization that she had been lying to my face for years. Every time she came home late from work, every business trip that was really a weekend getaway with Matt, those lies had been deliberate, calculated. She had looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine while carrying on an entire other life behind my back. That kind of betrayal was something I would never forgive, not just because of what it did to me, but because of what it did to our family. The kids, as much as they tried to act strong, were hurting in ways they didn't always show. My son, ever the stoic, stayed busy with work and school, but I could see the way his jaw tightened whenever Amy's name came up. My daughter was more open about her anger. She told me once that she didn't even know who her mother was anymore. How could she do this to us, she asked. I didn't have an answer for her because I was still asking myself the same question. In those quiet moments alone, I started thinking about the good memories too. It wasn't easy to sort through them without bitterness creeping in. There had been so many years of love, or at least what I thought was love. The early days of our marriage had been filled with hope and excitement, raising our kids together and dreaming about the future. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the woman who had shattered everything for a fleeting romance with someone who clearly didn't care about her. But as much as those memories hurt, they also gave me perspective. I realized that the Amy I had married wasn't the same person who walked out of our home that night. Somewhere along the way she had changed, or maybe she had always been that person, and I just didn't want to see it. Either way, the woman I loved was gone, and there was no point mourning her anymore. That realization didn't come all at once. It took time, conversations with my brother, and a lot of late nights sitting in the quiet house with nothing but my thoughts. I started to see Amy's betrayal not just as an ending, but as a turning point. For so long, I had defined myself by our marriage, by the roles of husband and father. Now, I had to figure out who I was without her. In the months after the divorce, I made a conscious effort to focus on myself. I started going to the gym regularly, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't just about getting in shape, it was about reclaiming control over my life. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen much of during my marriage. It felt good to have those bonds again, to laugh and talk without the weight of everything hanging over me. The kids became my anchor. Watching them navigate their own pain reminded me of how strong they were, even in the face of such betrayal. We grew closer in those months, sharing dinners, watching movies, and finding moments of joy in the midst of everything. They were my reason to keep moving forward, to keep building a life that was worth living. And then there was the surprising sense of freedom. For the first time in over 2 decades, I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself. There were no lies to untangle, no pretending to be okay for the sake of appearances. I could be honest with myself, even if that honesty was sometimes painful. It was a strange feeling, but also liberating. What stood out most during this time of reflection was how much I had grown. Amy's betrayal had broken something in me, but it had also forced me to rebuild, piece by piece. I wasn't the same man I was before, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was a good thing. I was stronger, wiser, and more aware of what I wanted from life. By the end of that chapter, I wasn't thinking about Amy as much. She was still a shadow in the background, but she no longer loomed over me. I wasn't sure what her life looked like now, and to be honest, I didn't care. My focus was on the future, on my kids, my goals, and the new life I was slowly but surely building. Amy may have closed one door, but I was determined to open another. Rebuilding my life was not a single, transformative moment, but a series of small steps that slowly led me out of the darkness Amy had left me in. The first step was reclaiming my home. After she left, the house felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. Empty, hollow, and steeped in memories of the life we'd built together. I realized I needed to make it my own again. I started with small changes, rearranging furniture, taking down old photos of Amy, and replacing them with ones of just the kids and me. The family portrait stayed, for the kids' sake, but everything else went. Then I tackled the bigger projects, painting the walls, buying new furniture, and creating a space that felt like mine. It was therapeutic, in a way, to physically transform the house as I worked on transforming myself. My routine also shifted. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and using the structure of my job to keep my mind busy. It wasn't just about staying distracted, it was about proving to myself that I could thrive, even without her. I became more involved in my kids' lives, too, attending their events and making an effort to be there for them in ways I hadn't always been able to before. The kids were my driving force. Watching them process the betrayal was heartbreaking, but it also showed me their resilience. My son, always the quieter one, started opening up more, sharing his thoughts and feelings about what had happened. My daughter, ever outspoken, didn't hold back her anger toward her mother, but she also softened when she saw me struggling. We leaned on each other in those moments, a small family pulling together in the aftermath of the storm. Amy, on the other hand, didn't stop trying to reach out. Every so often, she would send an email or a message, asking for updates about the kids or trying to justify her actions again. I ignored most of them. The few times I did respond, it was only to clarify logistics about the divorce or the kids. She didn't deserve more than that from me, and I didn't owe her anything beyond the bare minimum. I heard bits and pieces about her life from mutual acquaintances, though I didn't go looking for information. She was still struggling, apparently. Her social circle had all but disappeared, and she had been forced to take a less prestigious job after the fallout with Matt. It seemed like she was trying to rebuild, but her attempts were half-hearted and clumsy. She had burned too many bridges, and there wasn't much left for her to hold on to. Matt, predictably, had moved on without a second thought. He had been a stepping stone for Amy, and she had been a temporary distraction for him. It was fitting, in a way. She had thrown away her life for someone who couldn't have cared less about her. Knowing that brought me a strange sense of closure. Meanwhile, I was starting to find joy again, in ways I hadn't expected. Old hobbies I had set aside for years, woodworking, hiking, even photography, began to creep back into my life. At first, it felt strange to carve out time for myself, but the more I did it, the more I realized how much I had been neglecting my own happiness. For so long, my identity had been tied to being a husband and a father. Now, I was discovering who I was outside of those roles. Friends I hadn't seen in years began reaching out, inviting me to dinners or weekend outings. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to step back into the social world. But with a little encouragement from my brother, I started saying yes. Those moments of connection reminded me that life wasn't just about what I had lost. It was about what I still had and what I could create for myself moving forward. Romance wasn't even on my radar at that point, though a few well-meaning friends tried to set me up. I wasn't ready to open that door yet, and I didn't want to rush into anything for the sake of filling a void. For now, it was enough to focus on rebuilding my life and enjoying the small victories. An evening spent laughing with my kids, a project at work that went well, a quiet hike in the woods. One unexpected benefit of this new phase was the relationship I developed with my kids. Without Amy in the picture, we had the chance to grow closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. We started new traditions, pizza nights, road trips, even impromptu game nights that often ended with all of us laughing until our sides hurt. It wasn't the family life I had imagined, but it was ours, and it was good. There were still hard days, of course. Moments when the weight of everything would creep back in and I'd feel the anger, the sadness, and the loss all over again. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as time went on. I was learning how to live with the scars Amy had left behind, not by ignoring them, but by accepting them as part of my story. Moving on wasn't a straight line. It was messy and unpredictable, filled with setbacks and small triumphs. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. The life I was building wasn't the one I had planned, but it was mine. And that, more than anything, gave me hope. Months turned into a year, and slowly, the chaos Amy had unleashed on my life began to settle. The scars remained, of course, but they no longer felt raw. Time, it seemed, had dulled the edges of my anger and hurt. What surprised me most during this time wasn't how much I had healed but how much Amy's life had unraveled. Karma had a way of working itself out, and Amy felt every bit of its sting. Matt's reputation as a serial cheater had followed him to his new job. Word got out about his workplace escapades, and from what I heard, he wasn't welcomed there for long. It seemed he'd developed a pattern of leaving behind burned bridges wherever he went. Meanwhile, Amy remained stuck in the wake of his departure, her own reputation still in tatters. She had become something of a pariah. Socially, she was frozen out by most of the people she used to consider friends. The ones who still spoke to her were careful to keep their distance, likely worried about being associated with her mess. Even her attempts at rebuilding relationships with her family seemed half-hearted. Her parents were supportive but disappointed, and her siblings, who had once adored her, treated her with polite detachment. The professional consequences were equally harsh. Amy had managed to find another job, but it was a noticeable step down from the career she'd built over decades. Gone were the days of promotions and leadership roles. Her affair with Matt had not only wrecked her marriage but had also cost her the respect of her peers. People talked, and the industry wasn't as big as she'd thought. Every so often, I'd hear about another misstep she made in trying to rebuild her life. Once, she attempted to rekindle friendships with some of the women in our social circle, only to be met with awkward politeness and excuses. Another time, she tried to organize a community event, something she'd been good at in the past. But turnout was low, and the whispers about her past choices overshadowed the event itself. The kids had completely cut her off by this point. My son blocked her number, refusing even to read the messages she sent. My daughter, though angrier and louder in the beginning, eventually grew indifferent. She would roll her eyes whenever Amy's name came up and move on to another topic. It wasn't that they didn't care, they cared deeply. But they had reached a point where they didn't want her drama in their lives anymore. As for me, I had stopped keeping tabs on her. The updates I got came secondhand from people who still thought I'd want to know. But the truth was, I didn't. Her life was her problem now, and I had spent enough of my time dealing with her choices. Whatever happened to her, whether she found redemption or continued spiraling, it wasn't my concern anymore. My own life had started to take shape in ways I hadn't expected. I focused on myself and the kids, and the rewards of that effort were beginning to show. My relationship with my son and daughter was stronger than ever. We had settled into a rhythm, our little family finding its footing without Amy. I had also rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I took on new challenges at work, throwing myself into projects that felt fulfilling. I spent weekends hiking trails I hadn't explored in years, photographing landscapes and rediscovering my love for the outdoors. I even joined a local woodworking group, which gave me a sense of community I hadn't realized I needed. Romance remained on the back burner, though I was no longer closed off to the idea. A few women from my past reached out, old friends and acquaintances who had heard about the divorce. One in particular, a woman named Claire, stood out. She had been a friend in college, someone I'd lost touch with over the years. We started catching up over coffee, and though I didn't know where it would lead, it felt good to talk to someone who wasn't part of the mess Amy had left behind. The biggest surprise came when my daughter, who had been so angry for so long, finally smiled again. We were in the middle of a pizza night, our new tradition, when she laughed at one of my terrible dad jokes. It was the kind of laugh that shook her shoulders and lit up her whole face. It was the first time I'd seen that kind of joy from her since everything fell apart, and it hit me like a wave. It was in that moment I realized we were going to be okay. Not perfect, not unscarred, but okay. Life had a way of moving forward, even after the worst of betrayals. As for Amy, I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't wish her well either. She had made her choices, and now she was living with them. My focus was on the life ahead of me, the one I was building with my kids, my friends, and maybe, one day, someone new. I wouldn't let her betrayal define me. It was a chapter in my life, but it wasn't the whole story. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about how the rest of that story might unfold.